Banging at my front door just after sunrise, the Willow Glen Homeowners Association made it clear from the very first second that they had no respect for boundaries. They wanted my attention, and they weren't willing to wait. My name is Andrew Beckett. I'm 31 years old, and I live in a farmhouse left to me by my late grandfather. It sits on 8 acres of open land dotted with ancient oak trees, well beyond the official limits of the Willow Glen subdivision, or so I believed. Yet on that early morning, with the sky still grouse gray, I saw a woman in a crisp blazer rapping insistently against my screen door, her features set in a tight expression of disapproval. Her name was Karen Winters, and although I'd never met her, I recognized the type. Unflinching, authoritative, brandishing a clipboard like a weapon. She introduced herself in clipped tones, explaining that she was president of the Willow Glen HOA and that she needed to discuss urgent matters regarding my land. I rubbed the last traces of sleep from my eyes. The tension in the air told me I needed to brace myself. Karen launched straight into demands as though we'd already had an agreement. "We have a special occasion planned by our community members," she said, tapping a stack of papers, "and they need a picturesque rustic space. Your farmhouse has the right ambiance, so we've decided to host the ceremony here." I blinked, half convinced she was joking. "Ma'am, this property doesn't fall under the HOA's jurisdiction." Karen's expression hardened. "That's a temporary misunderstanding. We have authority over all land adjacent to Willow Glen. You'll find that your boundary lines are closer to ours than you think." Her self-assurance made my stomach knot. She offered no greeting, no courtesy, just instructions and requirements, implying that I should comply. Although I tried to inform her that I had never joined any HOA, she waved off my protest as if swatting a trivial fly. After skimming her list of necessary upgrades, which included a new fence, some landscaping changes, and the clearing of a small grove behind my barn, she stated, "The wedding is scheduled for September. I trust you'll be cooperative by then." I held my ground, voice shaky but firm. "I'm sorry, but you can't simply commandeer my home for an event. I'm not interested." Karen raised an eyebrow. She held up her clipboard, where I saw official-looking forms peppered with legal language about easements and communal privileges. "We're well within our rights," she claimed, pointing to paragraphs that I barely understood. "We can reclassify your land under certain conditions if it serves community needs. The board has already initiated the process." By then, my annoyance was turning into outright anger. She concluded by reminding me to expect an assessment soon, then pivoted on her heel and left. The arrogance of it all left me stunned. How could an HOA possibly justify turning someone's private farmhouse into their wedding venue without consent? I spent the rest of that morning pacing my living room, rereading the documents she'd left behind. Most references looked inflated or irrelevant, municipal codes twisted to suit their agenda. Although my grandfather's deed clearly stated we were outside Willow Glen territory, the papers Karen provided suggested otherwise, brandishing vague phrases like community expansion and adjacent property integration. I tried calling a friend who was generally knowledgeable about real estate, but all she could say was that HOAs sometimes use shady tactics to strong-arm homeowners. It wasn't a definitive answer, and I felt a chill of dread creeping in, as if 1,000 little legal threads were already being spun around me. Despite my nerves, I decided that I needed to push back early. On the 3rd day after her visit, I visited the county records office to confirm my land boundaries. The clerk there, an older man with a tired gaze, found a folder with my grandfather's name on it. He confirmed that the farmland was not within any HOA's mapped jurisdiction. Feeling relieved, I asked if Willow Glen had filed any expansions or annexation notices. The clerk pursed his lips. "There's been talk," he said, flipping through some additional sheets, "but I don't see an official filing. Maybe they're preparing to push it through the council. Keep an eye on them." I thanked him and headed home with a renewed sense of confidence, hoping to put an end to this nonsense. But Karen beat me to the next move. Around 6 the next morning, 2 uniformed police officers pulled into my driveway, their car lights off, yet the presence still intimidating. I threw on a jacket and went outside, finding Karen standing behind them with her arms crossed. One officer, clearing his throat awkwardly, said, "We received a call indicating a dispute. Miss Winters says you threatened her with violence if she returned to the property." My eyes widened. "That's not true," I shot back. Karen's expression was as smug as ever. "He made me feel unsafe," she asserted, voice trembling in a performance of victimhood. The officer glanced at me uncertainly. "Is there any reason you'd forbid her from stepping onto the property?" I exhaled, struggling to keep composure. "It's my private land and she's trespassing for an event I never consented to. I never threatened her. I just told her no." The second officer gave a subtle shake of his head as though he suspected she might be exaggerating. Nonetheless, they wrote down statements. Karen insisted I be warned about harassment. Eventually they left, leaving me rattled. It was clear she'd stoop to any level to pressure me. Over the next couple of days, I tried to continue my normal routine, tending to my orchard, feeding the goats, and making small repairs in the barn. The constant anxiety gnawed at me, though. Each time I heard an engine on the nearby gravel road, I'd tense up, anticipating more trouble. Late Thursday afternoon, I spotted a dark sedan parked by my fence, its occupant snapping photos of my property. When I walked closer, the driver sped away. Moments later, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You're complicating a process that's inevitable. Be rational." My heart pounded with a mix of anger and apprehension. I was dealing with an orchestrated campaign, not just an eccentric individual. At my wit's end, I called up a local attorney, Samantha Carter, who had represented some acquaintances in boundary disputes. We met in her cozy office, the walls lined with shelves of dusty law books. After I relayed the entire saga, Karen's bold intrusion, the alleged annexation, the wedding plan, the police incident, Samantha leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen thoughtfully. "They're either bluffing or exploiting some obscure clause in municipal codes," she said. "I wouldn't dismiss them. HOAs can be ruthless if they sense a profitable outcome. I'll dig into the legal specifics. Meanwhile, document everything." It was a relief to have a professional on my side, someone with the experience to fight back against legal intimidation. Samantha also suggested installing surveillance cameras around the perimeter of my land, which might prove helpful if further trespassing occurred. Sure enough, the following day, I caught a group of strangers snooping around my backyard with measuring tapes and clipboards. 2 men and a woman, all dressed in business casual attire, acting as though they had every right to be there. By the time I confronted them, they were taking photos of my barn doors. The woman introduced herself as an event consultant, insisting that I allow them to gather data for the bride and groom. My indignation roared up. I told them bluntly they had 60 seconds to vacate or I'd call law enforcement. One man muttered something about contacting Karen to report my lack of cooperation. They left in a swirl of dust, and I stood there, phone in hand, adrenaline burning my veins. I forwarded the details, along with a few pictures from my newly installed cameras, to Samantha. She fired off a cease and desist letter addressed to Karen Winters, along with the Willow Glen HOA board, demanding they stop unauthorized entry on my land. But from that point forward, the harassment only escalated. Signs began popping up along the roadside near my driveway. Colorful posters stating, "Future wedding venue of Willow Glen. Contact HOA for booking," complete with a phone number for inquiries. It was so brazen that I wasn't sure whether to laugh or rage. The next morning, I discovered my mailbox stuffed with pamphlets touting the benefits of communal living and how lending your land fosters neighborhood unity. Each pamphlet concluded with, "Don't be the stumbling block. Join us in making Willow Glen a place of celebration." I consulted with Samantha again, showing her the pamphlets. She frowned. "This is borderline harassment. However, it's still just marketing material unless they violate a specific law or direct threat. We'll keep it on record." She flipped through the text, lips tightening at the manipulative language. "They're framing you as the problem," she noted. "It's a PR strategy, painting you as selfish for not allowing them to have their wedding." My frustration mounted daily, and I found myself losing sleep. My orchard, which had always been a source of pride and tranquility, now felt overshadowed by a looming sense of dread. As rumors circulated, I got phone calls from neighbors. Some were outraged on my behalf. One man said, "Andrew, I've seen them do smaller land grabs, but never this overt. They must have big money behind them." Another neighbor quietly suggested I settle for a payout. If you resist too long, they might sabotage your property. The rumors about them hooking up with real estate developers are no joke. None of this advice alleviated my sense of injustice. This was my birthright, a farm my grandfather had nurtured for decades. I wasn't going to hand it over to people who viewed it as a stage for their fancy ceremonies. Then came the day Karen truly crossed a line. I was working on some fencing near the front of the property one afternoon when, out of nowhere, a pair of men in suits strode up the path, brandishing official-looking IDs. They introduced themselves as county inspectors, saying they were there to evaluate my place for potential zoning reclassification. I asked for their documentation, and sure enough, they presented forms that were suspiciously similar to the ones Karen had shown. When I pressed for details, they admitted they'd been contacted by the Willow Glen HOA. "We're following up on a community request," one inspector explained. "Supposedly your farmhouse is under consideration for a wedding venue." My voice rose. "Consideration by whom? I never requested a reclassification." The inspector gave a tense shrug. "We just go where we're told to go." I insisted they leave, telling them to get a real warrant or official directive next time. They backed off, though not before taking a few hurried pictures of my front porch. Later that night, while rummaging through my grandfather's old filing cabinets in search of anything that might help me, I found a faded envelope. Inside were land deeds going back nearly a century, along with a letter from the county stating that a section of the creek that ran behind our fields was considered an environmentally sensitive wetland. Grandpa had apparently lobbied for that designation to keep developers off. The letter mentioned that building or large-scale events near the creek could be subjected to additional scrutiny. This felt like a small ray of hope. Early the next morning, I forwarded scanned copies to Samantha, who called me right away, excitement in her voice. "Andrew, this is huge. If part of your land is protected, that could stop them cold. They'd have to get special permits for large gatherings, which might be impossible." She advised me to dig deeper, find any official stamp or county seal that validated the letter. I spent hours poring through dusty ledgers, eventually uncovering a notary sin statement verifying that a chunk of our acreage was indeed designated as a protected zone. Armed with this, Samantha said she would contact the county to confirm its current standing. Meanwhile, Karen had apparently found out about my attorney's involvement. She began sending repeated letters that were half threatening, half conciliatory. One read, "We regret the hostility you've shown, but if you cooperate by letting us use the farmhouse for the wedding, we'll refrain from further legal entanglements. We can even discuss a buyout beneficial to you." The nerve of her. This entire fiasco had started because she wanted to hold a wedding on my property without permission, and now she acted as though I was the hostile one. I decided not to respond, leaving all communication to Samantha. But it became obvious that Karen would keep applying pressure. Sure enough, 2 days later I stepped outside to find 3 large trucks parked along the gravel path, unloading an enormous white tent, foldable chairs, and decorative archways. My heart thundered. Workers were milling about, searching for the best place to set up. When I demanded an explanation, the foreman coolly replied that he had an order from Willow Glen HOA President Winters to do a preliminary test setup for a wedding ceremony scheduled in a few weeks. I shouted that this was illegal trespassing, but he just shrugged and pointed at an invoice showing my address. "We're paid in full for the day, buddy. If you got a problem, take it up with Karen." That was the final straw. I dialed the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation. A deputy arrived within half an hour. By then, the workers had hammered stakes into my yard and were halfway through assembling the tent frame. The deputy, a middle-aged man with a wary expression, asked them politely to leave. They insisted they had authorization. He repeated that it was private property, the landowner was objecting, so they had to pack up. With reluctance, they disassembled the half-built structure and hauled everything back into their trucks, cursing under their breath. Karen was nowhere to be seen, of course. She never dirtied her hands with grunt work. She wielded power from behind the scenes. Feeling my stress levels spike, I conferred with Samantha that evening, making a recorded statement about the day's events. "We'll file for an emergency injunction," she declared. "I'll need every scrap of proof you have, photos, text messages, security footage. If we get a judge to sign off, the HOA can be barred from interfering with your property until a final legal ruling." I breathed a small sigh of relief. Maybe the law would uphold my rights. Over the next week, we scrambled to compile documents. Samantha discovered that Karen had indeed filed a request with the county to annex my property under some obscure claim that it was historically part of Willow Glen. But the county records showed no legitimate basis. It appeared she was leveraging her connections to slip the request through. The hearing date for our injunction was set for early the following month. Meanwhile, I lived in a state of constant vigilance, expecting the next wave of intimidation. Around that time, I was approached by a local journalist named Alicia May. She'd heard rumors of the HOA's strong-arm tactics, and she wanted to interview me for an exposé on unethical associations. With Samantha's cautious approval, I agreed to talk. Anything to shine a light on Karen's manipulations. Alicia arrived one afternoon with a notepad and small camera. We sat on my porch, the warm summer breeze rustling the leaves overhead. She asked pointed questions about the timeline, the repeated trespassing, the involvement of county inspectors, and Karen's chilling calm. At one point, Alicia asked if I had any suspect that the HOA might be connected to bigger real estate interests. I told her about the rumors in town, how multiple neighbors had faced pressure to sell, and how my farmland would be prime real estate for someone wanting to develop out here. Alicia nodded thoughtfully. "I've heard similar stories. Some HOAs partner with local officials to rezone properties, then flip them for profit. There's a chance that's what's happening behind the scenes." She then inquired about the wedding itself, which had apparently been advertised in local bulletins. "Any clue who the bride and groom are?" I admitted I had no idea. All I knew was that Karen claimed to represent them. Alicia took meticulous notes, promising to investigate further. A few days later, a battered old pickup arrived at my gate. An elderly farmer named Harold stepped out, removing his cap politely. "I heard you were in a scrap with Willow Glen," he drawled. "I used to own some land out by their eastern border. They tried to chase me off once, threatened fines for not trimming hedges that were beyond their boundary. When that didn't work, they slapped a for sale sign on my lawn. I sold and moved before it got nasty." He looked genuinely remorseful, saying he regretted letting them bully him. "Fight them," he urged. "Don't let them take your home." His words steeled my resolve. I thanked him and offered him some produce from my orchard, which he graciously accepted. He left me with a final warning. "Keep watch. They'll do anything to force your hand." The days leading up to the court date were fraught with tension. My orchard duties felt like a welcome distraction, but every time I heard a car approach, my nerves flared. Late one evening, I noticed headlights lingering near the edge of my property. Grabbing a flashlight and my phone, I ventured closer. The vehicle sped off, leaving behind a small sign hammered into the ground. "Last chance to cooperate." I tore it out, frustration coiling in my gut. By then, word had spread around our small community about the hearing. Some folks were on my side, outraged that the HOA would stoop so low. Others seemed dazzled by the idea of turning farmland into a wedding spot that could bring the subdivision prestige. They accused me of being a recluse who refused to share my scenic property. Finally, the day came to meet in court. Samantha and I arrived early to organize our materials. Karen showed up with a tall, stiff-backed lawyer in a pinstriped suit, introducing him as Mr. Colton, counsel for the Willow Glen HOA. He eyed us with cool indifference, as though we were amateurs. Inside the small county courtroom, the judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes, listened patiently as Samantha laid out the repeated trespassing, the unauthorized attempts to build structures, the intimidation tactics, and the forged notion of annexation. Samantha referenced the environmental documents verifying that part of my land was protected wetlands, thus falling under special regulations that would make large gatherings nearly impossible. She concluded by handing the judge the photographic evidence we'd compiled. Mr. Colton countered with a rehearsed argument, claiming the HOA had historical rights to certain bordering properties, suggesting the farmland was once part of an older plat map tied to Willow Glen. He also dismissed the environmental restrictions as outdated. Then, in a move that made my blood boil, Karen took the stand and claimed that I threatened her life. She painted a picture of a belligerent farmer who refused to negotiate or listen to reason, who hurled insults, slammed doors, and waved guns around. My cheeks burned. I'd never threatened her, let alone shown a weapon. Samantha calmly asked if Karen had any proof or witnesses. Karen insisted that several neighbors had heard me rant, but she had no one in the courtroom to corroborate. It was so blatantly false that the judge seemed unimpressed. She asked about the wedding. Karen stated it was a community function meant to unify the neighborhood, insisting that my refusal was purely out of spite. Samantha then showed the judge the numerous letters and pamphlets that demanded I comply, along with the images of unauthorized construction attempts. When both sides finished, the judge announced she needed time to review the documents. She called for a brief recess. I stepped outside into the hallway, adrenaline rattling my limbs. Samantha remained calm, saying the evidence weighed heavily in our favor. Karen and Mr. Colton huddled at the opposite end of the corridor, whispering fiercely. After about half an hour, we reconvened. The judge cleared her throat and began with a grave tone. I find no credible basis for the HOA's claim that Mr. Beckett's property is under their governance, especially given the county records, the existing deed, and the protected wetland documentation. My pulse spiked with hope. Furthermore, she continued, the repeated trespassing incidents and attempts to schedule an event without explicit permission indicate harassment. She turned her gaze toward Karen. These actions are unacceptable. I am granting the injunction prohibiting the HOA from entering Mr. Beckett's property or advertising its use for any events. Should the HOA continue these tactics, they may face additional legal consequences, including potential civil liability. My entire body surged with relief. Karen's lips parted in disbelief. Her lawyer tried to protest that the annexation efforts were still pending, but the judge shook her head. Nothing in the county records validates that annexation, Mr. Colton. Until further notice, the farmland remains under Mr. Beckett's sole authority. Case adjourned. I nearly collapsed into my chair, overwhelmed with gratitude. Karen stormed out of the courtroom, ignoring the local reporter's questions and Samantha's attempt at courtesy. I realized that, while I'd won this round, the possibility of future appeal or backdoor tactics lingered. Still, the immediate victory was mine. Over the next few weeks, the phone calls and signs stopped. I didn't see any more random surveyors on my property. Some neighbors drove by to congratulate me, relieved that the HOA's heavy-handed approach had been challenged. I noticed a shift in the local mood. People who had been unsure before now spoke openly about the association's scare tactics. Word circulated that several other residents planned to file formal complaints. Karen's once unquestioned authority was crumbling. One afternoon, about a month after the court decision, I stood on my porch sipping iced tea when an SUV rolled down my driveway. I tensed, bracing for another unwelcome visit. But the person who stepped out was a middle-aged man in casual attire, his expression humble. He introduced himself as Charles Ward, the newly appointed interim president of the Willow Glen HOA. "Andrew, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. I reluctantly agreed. He offered a handshake, apologized for the former administration, and handed me a letter stating that the HOA was officially dropping any annexation pursuits. "I want to assure you," he said, "most of our members had no clue what Karen was doing. She was working with some real estate developers behind the scenes, promising them expansions. We found out she forged documents. My chest felt lighter at the news." "So what happens to her?" I asked. He shrugged. "She's resigned from the board. We're investigating possible embezzlement in the HOA's funds, but that's not my department." He then tried to extend an olive branch, mentioning that if we ever wanted to collaborate for local events in a truly voluntary manner, the new board would approach me respectfully. I said I'd think about it, though I wasn't eager to trust them just yet. Still, it was a relief to see the storm dispersing. My farmland, which I'd almost lost to a phony wedding scheme, returned to its quiet routine. The orchard needed harvesting, the goats needed grazing, and the stretch of wetland behind my fields quietly thrived under the lazy summer sun. Even though tensions had cooled, I occasionally glimpsed an expensive car cruising slowly past, perhaps a developer still lingering in hopes the situation might change. I kept my guard up, but refused to let worry rob me of my peace any longer. Instead, I focused on revitalizing the orchard. My apples were coming in well that season, and I even set up a small farm stand by the road for locals. People stopped by, praising the sweet fruit, sometimes sharing stories of their own run-ins with the HOA's lesser minions. A sense of community solidarity grew around me. After hearing my story, folks often chimed in with supportive remarks or brought along homemade jams in thanks for standing up to the bullies. It occurred to me that many people, especially those in older homes or near large subdivisions, suffered from the overreach of HOAs that had forgotten their original purpose. Karen's fiasco had inadvertently shone a spotlight on this dynamic. Samantha, ever meticulous, advised me to remain watchful for any appeals or legal cunning. There was a possibility that Karen or her developer allies might try to resurrect the wedding plan under a new guise. But, as the weeks passed, no such attempt materialized. Fall arrived, painting the orchard leaves in shades of gold and crimson. The air grew crisp, and I found a new kind of contentment, reminded daily that I had protected my grandfather's legacy from people who saw it as a commodity rather than a heritage. On a whim, I invited some friends and neighbors for a small harvest gathering. We set out a few tables near the barn, shared apple pies, fresh cider, and local cheeses. It felt good to open my land to people who appreciated it for genuine reasons, not a curated Instagram spectacle. As twilight fell, laughter mingled with the chirping of crickets, and I felt a profound sense of belonging. Shortly after that gathering, I received a surprise phone call from Alicia May, the journalist who had interviewed me previously. She wanted an update for her story on unethical HOAs, explaining that Karen Winters was now under formal investigation for forging certain municipal papers and possibly siphoning funds from Willow Glen's accounts. Alicia had uncovered a paper trail linking Karen to real estate developers who specialized in flipping farmland. "Your property was just one piece," Alicia said, "but I suspect it was central to their plan for a more expansive development. If they'd forced you to concede, they might have opened the floodgates to take more farmland on the outskirts." I shuddered at the magnitude of it. "Thank you for shining a light," I told her. She responded that my willingness to share my ordeal had helped her get leads from other homeowners, unveiling a web of corruption. "You might have saved a lot of folks from losing their homes," she said. Though the praise felt strange, I realized that defending one's property could indeed have a ripple effect beyond personal gain. Winter set in, and with it a hush fell over the farmland. The orchard's limbs grew bare. The wetland behind my fields glistened with thin ice. I took to reading in front of my fireplace on long evenings, flipping through some of my grandfather's old journals. He'd documented everything from weather patterns to anecdotes about community picnics. I smiled at the contrast between his simple joys and the complicated battles I'd fought, yet a sense of continuity warmed me. I was carrying on his unwavering spirit. Occasionally, I'd catch references to other expansions that had threatened the farm back in his day, but it seemed he'd always managed to fend them off with a combination of community support and well-researched knowledge of land rights. Reading those lines made me feel less alone. Then, sometime in mid-December, a letter arrived from the Willow Glen HOA's new leadership, reaffirming that they relinquished all claims to my property, stating in polite but formal language that they had no intention to pursue any joint usage or annexation. They also offered their apologies for the distress caused by previous board actions. While I remained cautious, I found a small measure of satisfaction that the official stance had shifted so far from Karen's original arrogance. There was no mention of the wedding plan anymore, no veiled threat. Apparently Karen had lost her grip on that dream, and I was free to live in peace. During those colder months, I busied myself with orchard maintenance and fence repairs. Marcella, a friend from town, dropped by occasionally with groceries or conversation. She had watched the fiasco unfold from a distance, occasionally popping in to lend moral support. One day, after we'd been chatting in my kitchen, she said, "Andrew, I'm proud of you for sticking it out. A lot of folks would have sold or rolled over." I shrugged, but the gratitude in her voice warmed me. I poured her some hot cocoa and said, "Honestly, if not for Grandpa's diaries and legal records, plus Samantha's help, I might have caved. Karen was more ruthless than I expected." We reminisced about that initial confrontation, how improbable it sounded, someone claiming they could seize farmland for a wedding. Marcello gave a slight chuckle. "If it hadn't happened to you, I'd have thought it was an urban legend." Another month slipped by in relative calm. Then, as the snow began to melt, a local environmental group reached out, wanting to discuss the wetland behind my fields. They had heard rumors of a farmland dispute that ended with the wetlands staying protected. Two of their representatives visited on a drizzly day, brimming with curiosity about the plant and animal life near the creek. The group suggested partnering with me to maintain the wetlands ecosystem, perhaps hosting small educational walks or birdwatching sessions. It was quite the contrast to Karen's forced wedding. This request came with respect. No demands, no underhanded schemes. They even offered to help with clearing invasive species. I told them I was open to it, so long as everything remained minimal and thoughtful. The more I learned about that wetland, the prouder I felt that we'd preserved it. Perhaps that was the real reason Karen's backers wanted the farm. Draining or modifying the creek could have opened the door to bigger projects. I recalled a conversation with Alicia, the journalist, who suspected these wetlands were the final barrier to a massive commercial plan. If so, I felt a sense of triumph that the land remained in local hands, safe from bulldozers. By early spring, the orchard came alive with blossoms. I walked among the rows of apple trees, inhaling the sweet aroma, realizing that a heavy weight had lifted. Samantha assured me that legally speaking, the case was closed. The HOA had no recourse as long as I maintained my property line and the environmental protections. Karen Winters, from the last update Alicia provided, was being investigated for misappropriation of HOA funds, forging zoning requests, and misrepresenting her authority. Whether or not she faced charges would depend on the outcome of an internal audit and possible testimony from others. I felt only mild curiosity about her fate. She had caused me grief, but I was relieved to be rid of her meddling. Occasionally, old resentments flickered within me, usually when I caught sight of the discolored patches in the yard where her wedding contractors had tried to hammer in tent stakes. Yet mostly I'd come to focus on the positive result. I'd stood firm, and now my home remained in my own hands. Throughout that summer, a quiet sense of freedom reigned. My orchard yielded a robust crop, and I made a tidy sum selling apples and homemade jam. Kids from a local school visited on a field trip, picking apples, feeding goats, and marveling at the wetland creatures. I used the opportunity to teach them about responsible land stewardship. If any cameo of Karen's fiasco lingered in my mind, it served only to underscore how precarious a farm's future could be if opportunists swooped in. At dusk, I sometimes sat on the porch, sipping mint tea, pondering Grandpa's diaries and how relieved he'd be that the place stayed intact. Rumor had it that some neighbors were banding together to reform the entire concept of Willow Glen's HOA, making it less about controlling people's lawns and more about supporting community projects. Perhaps that was wishful thinking, but even the possibility signaled a cultural shift, and I, for one, hoped it continued. That fall, Alicia published a thorough exposé detailing Willow Glen's murky relationship with developers. Though she didn't mention me by name, she did describe a scenario almost identical to my ordeal, referencing attempts to seize farmland for a community event. She also mentioned unscrupulous alliances that Karen had forged. Reading that article gave me chills. It confirmed how wide-reaching the corruption ran. I found a bittersweet satisfaction in having contributed to unveiling these underhanded tactics. A few weeks after the article appeared, I was unloading feed from my truck when an unfamiliar woman approached, wearing a hoodie and jeans. She looked uneasy. "Are you Andrew Beckett?" she asked. When I confirmed, she explained she'd been a volunteer for the Willow Glen HOA, roped into distributing flyers and scanning local property lines. At one point, she had believed the wedding story was a harmless community event. Only later, she discovered how manipulative Karen's plan actually was. "I'm so sorry," she said, voice trembling. "I just wanted to let you know, I never realized they were basically stealing your land." I mustered a forgiving smile. "I appreciate that. Next time, double-check the motives of your leaders." She gave a small, grateful nod before leaving. Strangely, that interaction helped close the book on any lingering bitterness. I realized not everyone in Willow Glen had been complicit. Many were simply blindsided or trusting. The fiasco had been orchestrated by a cunning few. Life pressed on. I occasionally got postcards from old friends who heard about the wedding fiasco secondhand, wanting to confirm the crazy rumor that an HOA tried to commandeer my farm. I'd send back short replies telling them it was no rumor, but everything was settled now. My orchard, my goats, and my wetland were safe. I rarely heard Karen's name anymore, unless it surfaced in hushed gossip about legal troubles or mismanaged budgets. By the time another winter rolled around, I'd grown used to my newfound normalcy. The anxiety that once haunted me whenever a vehicle slowed by my driveway no longer gnawed at me. Samantha remained a friendly contact, now helping me draft official guidelines for the wetland, so local birdwatchers or student groups could safely visit. We joked that I should run for some local council seat, but I had no desire for politics. I much preferred the soil under my nails and the orchard in bloom to the labyrinth of council meetings and legal bickering. I can't claim that everything turned idyllic. Even small towns have their share of drama. But my story, my battle against the HOA, had at least one definitive conclusion. I kept my home. The environment around the creek was left intact. No lavish wedding reception trampled the orchard grass, and ironically, my stand against them had helped expose unethical practices that might otherwise have remained hidden. Late in the next spring, on a clear blue afternoon, Marcella invited me to a local fair where vendors and farmers showcased their goods. I set up a small stand for my produce, expecting modest sales, but plenty of people recognized the orchard's name, linking it to the widely known fiasco. Some joked we're buying these apples to support the farmer who fought off the wedding bandits. Others simply said they admired how I'd refused to be bullied. I was grateful for their kindness, and I even felt a touch of pride. It was a far cry from those sleepless nights of worry, unsure whether Karen would show up with more bizarre threats or a squad of event planners. When the fair wrapped up, Marcella and I wandered through the stalls. She teased me about hopefully being done with lawsuits for a while. "Let's pray I never have to see a tent or a fancy arch in my yard again," I said, rolling my eyes. We shared a laugh, then parted ways. Driving home at dusk, I watched the sun dip behind the hills, painting the sky with pink and orange streaks. The orchard soon came into view, and the sweet familiarity tugged at my heart. Memories flashed of how close I'd come to losing it. My land turned into a spectacle for a bride and groom who likely never even knew the lengths Karen had gone to. I shook my head, letting the last warmth of the day calm me. I parked, hopped out of the truck, and walked the perimeter. The farmland felt peaceful, the goats munching contentedly near the fence, the wetland a silent tapestry of reeds and twilight reflections. My story might be unusual, but it was also a testament to how easily powerful entities can try to strip away your rights if you're not vigilant. Eventually, I found a renewed sense of purpose. I expanded my orchard a bit, planting a new row of saplings. I coordinated with local students to build birdhouses near the creek, fostering a safe space for migrating species. Once or twice, smaller HOAs from other regions contacted me for tips on balancing growth with respect for farmland. I shared what little advice I could. Get everything in writing, research your legal boundaries, stand up for yourself. Often, people just needed moral support to fight bigger interests. And every so often, I recalled Karen's early morning arrival at my porch, that confident rap on the door as though I had no say in the matter. The memory no longer burned with anger. It served as a reminder that adversity can lead you to discover strength you didn't realize you possessed. As seasons blended into years, the orchard thrived. The wetland behind my fields grew more robust, hosting egrets, herons, and a chorus of frogs that sometimes lulled me to sleep on warm nights. In a quiet moment one evening, I stood on the porch, gazing at the moonlight glistening over the creek. I remembered Grandpa's unwavering passion for preserving this land. It's a passion that lives in me. A handful of times I caught neighbors or visitors murmuring that I should open a small wedding service of my own. A legitimate barn-style venue, they joked. Each time I couldn't help but laugh. Maybe in some parallel universe that idea would have appealed to me. But after everything, I couldn't imagine intentionally turning the orchard into a commercial party site. No, I preferred the orchard's serenity, the quiet hush of the fields, the subtle shift of seasons. That was always the point of living out here, far from the noise and the complicated agendas of subdivisions. By the time I turned 33, I'd nearly forgotten the sense of panic that once kept me up at night. I'd replaced it with new memories. Building up the orchard, forging friendships with environmental groups, hosting small get-togethers for neighbors who actually appreciated farmland for its genuine charm. Whenever a visitor asked about that rumored wedding fiasco, I'd tell them the tale in simpler terms. That a pushy HOA tried to claim my land for a day of decorations and photos, expecting me to fold, but I didn't. And in that refusal, I uncovered deeper threads of corruption, exposed them, and helped my community see the truth. If they pressed for details, I'd share how police showed up at 6 a.m. after Karen's false 911 call, or how she tried to intimidate me with phony documents. But mostly, I left out the painful dread I'd felt. Instead, I emphasized the outcome. The farmland survived unscathed, and so did I. That was enough. One late autumn afternoon, as the sunlight skimmed the tops of the orchard's branches, I caught sight of an unfamiliar car pulling into the drive. I felt a flicker of worry, though not as pronounced as before, until a young woman stepped out, looking timid. "Hi," she called, eyes scanning the orchard with admiration. She explained that she was engaged, loved farmland, and wondered if I ever rented out the place for private ceremony. She'd heard from someone that I had a beautiful orchard. My entire body tensed for a second. Then I exhaled, reminding myself that not every wedding inquiry was a potential fiasco. I asked if she was part of an HOA. She laughed, confused. I told her politely that the orchard isn't available for events, but I wished her the best of luck. She thanked me graciously, took a few pictures from the roadside, and left, leaving me oddly reminiscent of how different the approach had been compared to Karen's. A respectful question, a polite departure. No pressure or assumption of entitlement. That's how any real conversation should go. In the quiet that followed, I realized how thankful I was to be free from that sense of looming aggression, from the unscrupulous people who thought my farmland was theirs to exploit. It made me all the more determined to protect these acres and pass them on if I ever had children with the same unwavering commitment Grandpa showed. The orchard's last leaves rustled in the breeze, and I caught the scent of apples on the air. If anything, Karen's incursion had taught me an important lesson about cherishing what's yours. I'd faced down a well-connected HOA and won, not just through legal strategy, but with the support of neighbors, an honest lawyer, and the abiding knowledge that the land held more than monetary value. It held memories, natural beauty, and intangible heritage. As twilight unfurled, I let my gaze drift to the horizon, where the sky blushed pink and purple. A wave of gratitude coursed through me. Although I might never forget the intrusion on my life and property, the victory now felt like a permanent part of the farmhouse's story. Woven into the worn floorboards, the orchard's fresh soil, the wetlands' gentle burble. Karen Winters and her dream of a forced wedding venue might be a chapter that's closed, but the sense of defending what's precious remains with me. That's how, in a swirl of conflict and resolution, a farmland became something more than a quiet inheritance. It became a symbol of resilience, preserving both family legacy and the harmony of the natural world. And whenever I recall that determined knock at dawn, I simply smile, secure in the knowledge that the orchard stands, my rightful home stands, and I stand, rooted, unyielding, on this land my grandfather loved.